Hey everybody, thanks for joining me in this first class. We're going to be talking a lot about some basic photography, exposure, a little bit of history, various other odds and ends like lighting and composition as well. A couple of things first, right off the top. Um, I do want to let you know that I am re-recording this from our live broadcast. I had some audio issues, so I should be able to go back and hopefully cover everything as accurately as I covered things before. I'm probably going to upload this in two parts. This being part one. Part two is going to be starting with some of the exposure techniques that I've been asked about over time. So the second part, actually, the recording turned out fine, so I'm not going to be changing anything there. But a couple of things that I want to go over here, first and foremost, is everybody's using different cameras. I grew up on Nikon, and I've been using Nikon for 34 years. And what I want to make sure that you guys, I guess, are when it comes to some of the techniques and menu items in here, I'm going to pretty much stress to you that you're going to need to go to your manual. I know some of the settings on some of the other cameras, but am not 100% familiar with them. So uh, the idea here is to get you used to what your camera can do as opposed to where the buttons are, switches, menu items, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you'll be able to do a little bit of research on your own for those things, and everything should be pretty much straightforward. So with that, we'll get started. Like I said, we're going to cover a lot of different things, and I'm going to go down the list and we'll kind of figure out exactly what it is we're going to be talking about. So let's get started. Okay, let's talk a little bit of history here, just about in cameras in general and kind of where they've come from and where they are now. Cameras have been around for a couple hundred years plus, um, and the basic concept of the camera has not changed. The idea of a camera, contrary to popular belief, you're not capturing images, you're capturing light. And by using the methods by today's standards, aperture settings and shutter speed and ISO, pretty much those things have been in existence for as long as cameras have been in existence as well. You go back to old vintage photos, sometimes you'll see ghosting in the photos, especially if it was a family picture with kids in it, because a lot of times they would have to make their exposures up to 30 seconds long in order to get a decent exposure. Well, in 30 seconds, kids are not going to stand still. So things have gotten better as far as more improved shutter speeds and things like that. The medium has changed, obviously. Um, Film was real big and about the only thing you could capture too when I started. I've been doing this for about 34 years, so I've gone through the whole transition between film and digital. And then eventually came digital. With digital, there's a lot of advantages, some disadvantages. Well, not disadvantages per se, but um, a different way of thinking about things. So, one of the things that we may cover, if I don't cover it in this class, I'll be covering it in Lightroom and Photoshop as we move forward with those. So, one of the big questions I get, speaking of Photoshop and Lightroom, are questions about processing. I know a lot of people say that they want to get the best picture that they can out of their camera, which is what you should always strive for. Don't use tools like Photoshop and Lightroom to fix your photos. Use them to enhance your photos, and that's really important. A lot of people will take a shot, they'll look at it and they'll go, oh, I'll fix it in Photoshop. Um, you start off with that mentality, you're always gonna kind of end up shooting the same, making the same mistakes, and it's something that you don't want to do. You want to be able to grow beyond that. Um, But keeping in mind that even though you have Photoshop now and you have Lightroom now, uh, you go back into the film days, and pictures have always been manipulated in one way or another, whether it was hand touch-ups, whether it was using darkroom techniques, things like that. Keep in mind that photos have always been in one way or another retouched. Ansel Adams, you look at his stuff, very contrasty and everything. Part of it, you had a little bit more flexibility in the film that you bought and used, but part of it was done in different techniques that were a little bit more manual than they are now. So it gives you a little bit of an idea that that you can use these tools to your advantage, and you're not really cheating because you're doing the same thing that you've done all along. It's just a little bit different now. So now the camera and the lens, again, the two obviously have to work together to make things work out correctly. And we're going to get a little bit more into that marriage between the camera and the lens and exactly how the two work together. The lens being your main focus for aperture, your camera being the main focus for your shutter speed and your ISO. So as we move forward, we'll be talking a little bit more about how they interact with each other and what makes all this work together, depending on lenses that you're using, depending on the settings in your camera, is really going to depend on what you end up with in the long run. So as we get a little bit further into the course, we're really going to be looking at some different lenses and how they work and what their purpose is. And we'll be looking at a lot of the camera settings and how they work and how you're going to be able to bring all those techniques and get comfortable with them and really take your photography to another level to hopefully get you really proficient at everything that you need to learn to become a really good photographer. Okay, now the big one, taking it out of auto. Now this is something that I've gotten tons and tons of questions on from a lot of different people. The intimidation factor of taking it out of auto is one of those things that hopefully we're going to get you past during the course of this class. Really being able to understand how everything works together, how your exposure, your shutter speed, and your ISO work together. One of the things about working in auto, which you can kind of utilize as a tool, and strictly as a tool, is to be able to shoot in auto. And if you're using a program like Lightroom or a program that will show you the metadata, it will work in your favor as a learning tool. Because you can look at the metadata, you can look at the shutter speed, you can look at the aperture, and you can look at ISO settings and see what everything's doing. When you're in auto mode, all those things and your camera is going to be doing the thinking for you. But the ultimate goal here is to get you guys out of auto, get you guys more comfortable with using shutter priority, aperture priority, or going full manual. One step beyond auto is using program, and we'll discuss this a little bit more in detail and how that's going to work in your favor as well. So it's one of these things that it might be a little bit overwhelming at first, but eventually with a little bit of practice you'll get the idea and you'll get the hang of it. Now exposure, again, part of taking it out of auto is getting the exposure that you need, that you want, depending on the situation that you're in. If you shoot sports, you're going to look at things in a different way than if you shoot portraiture or if you shoot landscapes. And the combination of how to utilize shutter speed and aperture in those different situations are going to make a difference. Lastly, we're going to touch a bit on some lighting and composition and a few other little things. I'm going to give you guys some tips on some light modifiers and a couple of other things. So we've got quite a bit to cover. I definitely want to get some questions answered, and as I said, I'm re-recording this, so any questions you might have on any of this stuff, please feel free to email me. My email address will be at the end of the presentation, and you can contact me at any time, and I'll try to get back to you. Or you can contact me through the Facebook group, and kind of go that way. So, with all that said, let's start moving forward, and let's get some basics down before we get to some of the more serious stuff. All right, here we go. One of the first things that I want to touch on is full frame versus cropped frame. And I get this a lot. Um, a full frame camera is equivalent to, as you can see on the diagram here, a full frame is equivalent to 35 millimeter film, or a 35 millimeter film frame. Now, the higher end cameras, whether you're going Nikon or Canon, you have the choice of either doing a cropped frame or full frame camera. Now, the crop frame, it's equivalent to 24 millimeter film. Now, what does that mean, and what do these numbers mean? Well, you got to do a little bit of math. So if you look at, for instance, Nikon again, I grew up on Nikon, so I'm a little bit more familiar with it. But you can see that where it says Nikon, it says times 1.5, and where you see Canon, it says times 1.6. So basically what that means, if you're shooting with a full frame camera and you have a full frame lens, say you have a 50 millimeter lens, a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera is going to be a 50 millimeter lens. Okay, if you take that full frame lens and you put it on a cropped frame camera, in this case, again, my example is going to be Nikon, what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with that 50 millimeter lens being at about a 75 millimeter lens because of that cropped frame. So again, 1.5 times the strength of that lens is going to be approximately a 75 millimeter lens. With Nikon, you can, if you have a DX or a cropped frame camera from Nikon, you can use both FX lenses and you can use DX lenses. With Canon, from what I understand, full frame lenses go on their full frame cameras, and cropped frame lenses go on their cropped frame camera. So I want to make that pretty clear. In that way, Nikon has a little bit more flexibility. However, again, keeping in mind that if you do use a full frame lens on a Nikon, you have to do the math to see exactly what it's going to be. One of the lenses that I use is a 70-200, and again, I have to do the math at 70 millimeters to 200. You're looking at approximately a 90 to close to 300. Quickly doing the math in my head and really giving you guys a big approximation. Again, when you look at lenses, when you look at buying a lens, that's the one thing that you want to look at, or make sure that you understand that if you're using a cropped frame camera, that you can use a cropped frame lens. In the case of Nikon, it's DX, and I believe in the case of Canon, it's S. So you want to make sure that you look at the appropriate lens. So if you, again, for instance, in Nikon, if you get a DX lens, a 50 millimeter lens is going to be a 50 millimeter lens. If you get a full frame lens from Nikon, again, then you got to do the math and say that, okay, I'm buying a 50 millimeter full frame lens. It's going to give me approximately 75 millimeters. So keep that in mind when you're looking at lenses and when you're looking at cameras. Cameras are getting pretty well, and you're going to find that most high-end photographers are using full frame cameras. So the DX cameras are great cameras. Mine is a DX camera, but I love it. So keep that in mind when you start looking at cameras and lenses. So one of the other things that I want to make sure that you guys understand too is how you hang on to this camera when you're shooting. A point and shoot, one of the things that you're used to doing with point and shoot is holding it out in front of you. And the problem with that is you end up having a stability issue. Yes, the camera's smaller. Yeah, you can hold a little bit more steady. But when you start getting into DSLR photography, larger lenses, a little bit more weight on the camera, and necessary balance, you have to kind of keep that in mind. So as you can see from this shot here, one of the things that you want to do is you want to be able to hold the camera up to your face. Now, I've seen a lot of people take DSLRs and they'll turn on the live view and they'll hold the camera out in front of them, and then they wonder why their shots aren't quite in focus, especially if they're shooting at a slightly slower shutter speed. So what you want to do is you want to be able to balance that camera. As you can see, he's got his hand underneath the lens. He's got his elbows tucked in close to him, and then he's got his feet, which you can't see, but he's got his feet about shoulder width apart. What that's going to do is that's going to stabilize you and in effect make you the tripod. Usually with when you're hand holding a camera, generally you don't want to hand hold a camera at a shutter speed of less than 1/60th of a second, because then you start getting into the slower shutter speeds and every slight movement is going to be seen, so you might get blurred photos. So you have to be real careful about that. But down to a 60th of a second, being able to really hold on to your camera is really important, and making it stable. Now, in this next shot, you can see a bunch of little points. This is if you're looking inside your LCD on your camera, or I'm sorry, looking through your viewfinder on your camera. And these are generally going to be your focus points, and we're going to get into talking about focus points a little bit later here. But basically, those focus points are going to guide you as to where your focal point is going to be. So you can see there's a cluster of them. And again, depending on your model of camera and what you guys take a look at in your manuals, it'll give you a better idea of how many focus points your camera has and how to set up your focus points for different shooting situations. So we'll talk about that as well. But basically, you want to use those focal points that you see inside your viewfinder to line up and focus your shot. When you're in certain focus modes, it's also going to give you metering options and how that all works. So here's your different focus modes. You got AFC, which is continuous, and or servo, and it's basically good when you're photographing moving objects. So if you're shooting sports or a race or something like that, use continuous autofocus. Now, if you're doing things like portraiture, if you're doing still life, or you're doing macro photography, AFS is probably your best choice, because what it's going to do is it's going to pick a single focus point, and it's going to use the camera's focus to focus in on that point, whether it be a flower. When you're doing portraiture, I usually advise people try to focus on the eyes, because that's what's going to matter most in a portrait and give you the most impact. And again, if you're doing macro photography, you want your focus to be directly on the object that you're going to be using. Now, AFA, which is auto focus points, basically what that's going to do is it's going to give you the best of both worlds. So depending on the situation that you're in, if you happen to be shooting football and then you see a flower sitting off to the side there, the camera's going to basically take that information and it's going to decide whether it wants to use a single focus point or multiple focus points as you take your shots. So auto is going to kind of give you the best of both worlds. Single is going to give you a single area to focus in, and continuous is going to give you the best option for focusing, or focusing on objects that are moving, be it cars, football, gymnastics, whatever it is you might be shooting. So again, check your manual to see what your focus options are and set them appropriately. Again, like exposure, it's one of these things that you want to practice with and get comfortable with, because you don't always want to just set it to autofocus and leave it there. And again, don't get this autofocus confused with autofocus on your camera, two different things, which we'll touch on in a little bit here. So you got continuous focus, single focus, and then you have your auto focus, which gives you the best between the two modes. Okay? So what you're seeing now is what you would see when you look through your viewfinder, and you're going to see multiple squares throughout. And basically what you're looking at is you're looking at the focus points that your camera offers. Different cameras are going to be different in how many focus. Each one of those is a focus point. Some cameras have 11 focus points. Some cameras have as much as in the 50s or 60s in focus points. And again, the higher end the camera, the more focus points you're going to get, and the more accurate your focus is going to be. So again, you have to kind of look into your camera and see how many focus points your camera actually has. Now, you don't always see this. If you're working in continuous focus, for instance, as you're looking through your viewfinder, you may see these focus points change as you're following an object or something like that. Now, if you're in a single focus mode, basically you're going to have one focus point in there. So you're going to see one square, and that's basically where you're going to point your camera, or where you're going to put that square to focus. So again, if you're doing portrait photography, you want to put that focus point right on the person's eye and then refocus. Now, one of the things that you're able to do in most cameras, and again, you need to check your documentation, is if you're in single focus mode, you can move that focus point around. As well as being continuous, you can also move those focus points around. And the idea is, say for instance, you're shooting vertically, and if your focus point is right in the center, but your subject eye, when you turn your camera vertically, is closer to the top, you can take and move that focus point into the area that's closer to that person's eye. If you don't, which you don't have to, what you can do is keep that focus point in the center. You'll compose your shot to where that focus point is over that person's eye. You'll half press your shutter speed, and then you'll recompose your photo. So basically, by keeping it in the center, focusing, and then recomposing your photo, then you can go ahead and use a single focus point in that way. Works just the same, but basically what you're doing is you're half shutter pressing to get your focus on the person's eye, and then you're just recomposing your shot to what you needed it originally. Okay, so let's talk about kit lenses versus fast lenses, and I'm using the term fast lens, and you'll understand why in a minute, but basically a kit lens is usually what you get with your camera. When you purchase a camera, a lot of times they'll purchase, or they'll sell them in a kit, so you get the camera and maybe a lens or two. Now, the big difference between a kit lens and a fast lens is going to be quality. Okay, most kit lenses are okay for everyday use, kinda, but when you start shooting a little bit more high-end projects, whether it's doing portrait work, whether it's doing landscape work, travel photography, so on and so forth, you want to look into getting better lenses. And I'm going to explain the difference between the two and their limitations and the advantages of a faster lens over a kit lens. The best way to tell that you have a good lens is price. Plain and simple. An aftermarket high-end lens is going to give you a lot more glass elements. It's going to give you a lot of features that you're not going to see in a kit lens. One of the big features and one of the references to the term fast lens is the aperture setting. Most kit lenses have an aperture setting, a maximum aperture setting of between 3.5 and 4.5. And it doesn't give you as great a depth of field, and we'll discuss depth of field in a little bit. Whereas a faster lens, is going to give you a a faster aperture or a wider aperture, so anywhere from 2.8 to a 1.8, 1.4. So with that, you're going to end up with more depth of field, and a lot more control over what you can do with your lens in conjunction with your camera. So a couple of the differences, and one of the things that I want to explain about DX lenses and how they work and what to look for, is if you look at the DX lens that I have up here, and again, this is a cropped frame lens, you're going to see that I have circled there, it says 4.5 to 5. Now what that means is when that lens is wide open, and this is a 55 to 200, when it's set at 55, the lowest aperture you're going to get is 4.5. When you're zoomed all the way into that 200 millimeter point, the most open that lens, or the lowest aperture for that lens, is going to be 5 or 5.6 in this case. Now if you look on the right hand side, this is a 2.8 lens. Notice it only has the number 2.8, and even though it's if it's a zoom lens, what that means is, unlike the kit lens, this gives you an aperture of 2.8 whether you're at 70 millimeters or at 200 millimeters. I'm saying the instance of a 200 or a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. Your most open that lens is going to be is 2.8. It doesn't matter how much you zoom in and how much you zoom out. It's always going to give you a 2.8 aperture, and whatever it is, when you close it down, if you're shooting landscapes, you're going to use smaller apertures. Keep in mind that the lower the number in apertures is the larger the aperture. The higher the number is, the smaller the aperture. And again, we'll kind of get into the difference between the two. But a fast lens, like I said, it's going to give you better aperture, better depth of field. It's going to give you better options as far as glass and elements within there. You're going to notice too, if you pick up a DX lens or a kit lens compared to an aftermarket lens, an add-on lens, whatever, that's a faster lens, you're going to see a huge weight difference between the two, because in order to achieve that consistent 2.8 throughout a zoom range, takes a lot more glass elements and a lot heavier construction. So you're definitely going to know the difference between the two. And then of course when you shoot, you're going to notice a huge difference between the two. So we'll get into a little bit more what those numbers mean as we kind of move forward here. Okay, and a couple of other things that I want to make sure that you guys kind of understand too, and a bit of a question here. Prime lenses are a single focal length lens. So a 50 millimeter is a prime lens, a 105 millimeter is a prime lens, 20 millimeter, 28 millimeter prime lens. So if you don't hear a zoom reference, so like a 55 to 200 is a zoom lens, and it is not a prime lens. A single numbered lens, again, 50 millimeter is probably the most popular. That is going to be considered a prime lens. Now, there are a lot of different lenses out there and a lot of different aftermarket manufacturers. I own a couple of Tamron lenses, and I've used a Sigma lens. I understand there's some focusing issues with the Sigma lens, but I have to say the Sigma lens that I used, which was a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, was actually a pretty good lens, and I didn't have any focusing issues with it. However, that being said, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So one of the things that you guys might want to do is, when you go out looking for a lens, take your camera with you. Take several shots. If you have a laptop, bring the laptop with you. pop your card into the laptop, and take a look at the pictures to see how they're doing. One of the things that I like about aftermarket lenses is that they're usually a little bit cheaper, and not that they're necessarily cheaply made, because they are good quality lenses, um, but like with some things, you pay for the label, and paying for that label is generally what's going to cost you a little bit more money. Couple of other things that I want to touch on are some important buttons and dials. First thing I want to touch on is what you're looking at right here is your viewfinder, and this should be in existence on any camera that has this type of a viewfinder. Again, this is a standard viewfinder. Some of the newer cameras are coming out with electronic viewfinders. Personally, I don't care for the electronic viewfinders because a lot of people look through them and they'll see a lot of noise and a lot of grain, and they'll think that that's what's happening in their pictures. It's not. That's just strictly a viewfinder. Your camera settings are going to determine on what your pictures look like. However, the button that you're looking at, or the dial that you're looking at, is called a diopter. And basically what that's designed to do is to adjust the focus of your viewfinder, whether it be an electronic viewfinder or in this case a standard viewfinder. Best thing to do is half press your shutter speed. You'll look near the bottom of your viewfinder and you'll see all the numbers down there, shutter speed, aperture, so on and so forth. And what you want to do is you want to adjust that dial so those numbers are in focus. And it's going to be different for everybody. I wear glasses. I know some people wear contacts, so it's going to be slightly different for everybody, but that's there to help you to make sure that everything that you're going to be seeing through your viewfinder is going to be in focus. And again, keep in mind that this does not affect the final result in your camera. This is strictly just for your viewing comfort, to make sure that everything is that you're seeing everything in focus. Again, has nothing to do with the output of your camera. Okay, so keep that in mind when you make these adjustments. This particular adjustment is strictly for you, and it's going to change from person to person. So if you look through the viewfinder and you see, this isn't quite in focus for me, first thing you want to do is go to your diopter. Make sure that it's set correctly. You might hit it while you're putting your camera away or something like that, so you might have to reset it. But again, this is a device that's been around for a very, very long time, and it really helps to make you a little bit more comfortable with your camera as far as making sure that you're looking at things that are in focus, if that makes sense. Okay, next I want you guys to take a look at on the side of your camera and on your lens. So this is going to be a couple different things here. You have auto and manual focus on your lens. So if you look on your lens, you'll usually see a switch that says A or M. A, auto, M, manual, which means that in manual mode, you focus your lens yourself. Now, I personally depend on autofocus quite a bit, again, because I'm a little bit older and my eyesight's starting to go. So it helps me out a little bit more to have that extra assistance. Now, depending on the camera that you have, and this is one thing that's very important when you're looking at lenses as well, is to be able to understand your camera. With Nikon, I can use older lenses with my older autofocus lenses with my camera. And the reason that I can do that is on the body of my camera, I have a Nikon D7100. There's an auto manual focus switch on the side of the camera, which you can see on the illustration here, and there's an auto manual focus on the lens. Now, the deal with that is most of the newer lenses that come out and the cameras that come out, part of the reason that they're a little bit more compact and a little bit lighter and everything is because the focus motor is built into the lens. Now, if you have on the body of your camera an auto manual switch, that means there's a motor built into the camera as well. So it allows me to use an older lens that doesn't have autofocus built into the lens itself. So if I switch that over to auto, which I keep it on auto on my body all the time, I can switch out lenses and not have to worry about it if I'm using an older lens versus a newer lens. Now, on my newer lens, again, you have your auto and your manual setting, and keep in mind that on your lens, that the motor is built into the lens. So again, if you're buying a newer lens, you just want to make sure that the focus mechanism or the focus motor is going to be compatible with your setup. And again, the way you do that is you take your camera with you to the camera shop or whatever, and you put the lens on your camera and you make sure that it's going to work appropriately. So that gives you an idea as to what you need to do as far as focusing. Now, the next two things that I want to cover, and again, I've got two shots up here. I've got the top of a Canon camera and the top of a Nikon camera. And these are the different settings for your camera. Now, one of the things that I want to concentrate on, since this is the direction we're going with this class, is I want to concentrate on the areas that are not in green, okay? The green setting on both of these cameras is auto. Since we're trying to get out of auto, I'm not even going to talk about auto. The other settings that you have, if you look on the right, on the Nikon camera, you have M, A, S, and P. M is manual, A is aperture priority, S is shutter priority, and P is program mode. Okay, Canon, it's a little bit different. On Canon, you have, going from the bottom, you have P, which is program. You have TV, which is time value, and that's basically your shutter speed. Okay, and then you have AV, which is your aperture value, and then you have manual. On this one, you have well, basically, those are the ones that I want you guys to focus on. Are those four: the P, the TV, the AV, and the M on a Canon, and the M, the A, the S, and the P on Nikon. Now, just because the terminology is a little bit different between the two, that does not mean that the functionality is different between the two. The functionality of these two cameras is exactly the same. So it's just the terminology each company uses. I believe Sony is set up the same way with M, A, S, and P. Canon's a little bit different. So again, if you get confused by what the terminology or what the initials for the terminology mean, just look in your manual. Okay, now I want to go ahead and just have us take a little bit of a break. As I said, I'm re-recording these, and I'm probably going to post them up in two different parts. So this would technically be the end of part 1, and we're going to pick up with the shooting modes in part 2. So take a minute, go grab some coffee before you start part 2, and we'll get on it. All right, we'll see you soon.